Number 3. Gary Addison Taylor. Gary Addison Taylor was born in Howell, Michigan in March 1936. He only had one brush with the law while he was living there. He had shot out the windows of a store with a pellet gun. When he was 15, his family moved to Treasure Island, Florida. He joined the Navy, but he was discharged after 11 months because he said he had problems with migraines. He later said he didn't like the Navy and wanted out, so he lied about having migraines. On Christmas Eve 1954, Gary approached a 39-year-old woman who got off the bus at a bus stop in St. Petersburg, Florida. Gary told the woman not to scream or he would kill her. The woman screamed and Gary hit her in the head with a wrench. He then fled. The woman was taken to the hospital and she had emergency surgery. She survived her injury but spent 5 days in the hospital. Over the next month, 16 other women were accosted at bus stops in St. Petersburg. Many were groped, but they were not seriously physically injured. The attacker was dubbed the bus stop marauder. Then, on January 22, 1955, 18-year-old Gary Taylor was arrested after he accosted 2 women at 2 different bus stops. The women and other witnesses described his car to the police. The police found him parked close to another bus stop. On the floor of his car was a wrench. The 17 women who were attacked were brought to the police station. 6 identified Gary by his voice. Gary was charged with 1 count of assault for the attack on the woman on Christmas Eve. Gary Taylor went to trial in November 1955. The 6 women who identified Gary's voice testified that Gary attacked them. This included the woman who was hit with a wrench. The judge ruled that since Gary was not charged with those other assaults, the jury should ignore the testimony of the other 5 women. Gary's family and his family's friends testified that he was home on Christmas Eve. After a 2-day trial, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. Gary Taylor was acquitted of the assault. After the trial, Gary and his family moved to Royal Oaks, Michigan, which is about 14 miles north of downtown Detroit. On December 22, 1956, Gary shot a 14-year-old girl in the back as she was walking with her friend in Southfield. She was not seriously injured. Over the next month and a half, he shot at people walking, driving their cars, and standing near the windows in their homes in Southfield. The shooter was called the Phantom Sniper. On February 7, 1957, Gary shot a 19-year-old woman in the shoulder while she was standing on her porch. About 20 minutes later, he fired at 2 women who were standing at a bus stop. The bullet went between them. 5 minutes later, he shot at a woman in a car. He fired 2 shots and missed both times. 5 minutes after that, he shot a woman who was standing in her home. The bullet hit the molding of the window. 3 minutes later, he shot at a young woman who was returning home from the grocery store. He also missed her. 20 minutes later, he fired at another woman who was in her home and missed her. 5 minutes later, Gary committed his 7th shooting in 2 hours. He shot into a house and the bullet grazed the cheek of an 11-year-old girl. Several people described the shooter's car to the police. It was a black and white Chevrolet. About an hour after the last shooting, the police found the car and arrested 20-year-old Gary Taylor. In his car, they found a .22 caliber rifle. Gary quickly confessed that he was the Phantom Sniper. There were 16 shootings in total, and 3 women were injured, but no one was killed. Gary was asked why he did it, and he said, quote, "I have had the urge to hurt since I was in the 3rd grade. I've had this bug in me since I was a child. It's a sex drive compulsion," unquote. He said while he was in the Navy, he fantasized about hurting women. He said, quote, "I like to shoot women. "I had an urge to shoot, and I like to shoot women," unquote. He also said he had beaten a woman with a wrench in Florida. Gary underwent a psychiatric examination. He told the psychiatrist he started seeing sex workers when he was 15. He then started getting violent with them. He enjoyed seeing the fear in their faces. In February 1957, there was a sanity hearing, and 3 psychiatrists testified that Gary was, quote, dangerously mentally ill, unquote. One of the psychiatrists said if he were to be released, he'd probably kill a woman. So Gary was sent to the Iona State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Iona, Michigan. Less than 2 years later, in November 1959, Gary was transferred to the Lafayette Clinic in Detroit, Michigan. In May 1960, he was allowed to leave the facility to attend arc welding classes and to go home on the weekends. Then, in April 1961, Gary was arrested again. He was renting a room in a halfway house. He attacked his 53-year-old landlord and her daughter with an 18-inch machete. The women were able to fight him off, and they were not seriously injured. In custody, Gary confessed to other crimes. Months earlier, in December 1960, he posed as an IRS agent and talked his way into the home of a former beauty queen. He sexually assaulted her and stole $13. A month later, he choked out a woman working in a clothing store. She survived the assault. There were no trial for the 3 attacks. Instead, Gary was sent back to the Iona State Hospital. In 1970, Gary was transferred to the Forensic Psychiatry Center in Ypsilanti, Michigan. In July 1972, a doctor said he believed that Gary was not dangerous if he took his medication and did not drink alcohol. So that month, 36-year-old Gary Taylor was released from the hospital, but he had to routinely return to the hospital for treatment. Not long after Gary was arrested, he married a woman named Helen. He had met Helen before the sniper shootings. When Gary was sent to the psychiatric hospital, Helen married someone else. But the marriage ended after 2 years. Helen's ex-husband said that Helen was always open about her love for Gary and her plans to marry him one day. After getting married, Gary and Helen settled in Onstead, Michigan. For about a year, Gary went for treatment, but by the summer of 1973, he had stopped going back to the hospital. Gary and Helen moved over 2,300 miles away to Seattle, Washington. On November 27, 1974, their neighbor, 19-year-old housewife, Bonnie Stuth, went missing. Her husband of 5 months was working that evening. He returned home at 1:15 a.m. and discovered the front door was unlocked. The TV was on, and in the kitchen, half-prepared Jell-O, which was for a family party the next day, was on the counter. Bonnie's coat and shoes were missing, but her purse and car keys were there. Her car was also parked in the driveway. Bonnie's husband reported her missing. Bonnie's sister said she talked to Bonnie around 10:30 p.m. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. When Bonnie returned, she said that the neighbor from across the road asked her if she wanted a dog. She told him to return the next day and talk to her husband. When the police went to question the neighbors across the road, Gary and Helen Taylor, they discovered that their house was empty. The police tracked them down. They were living in Enumclaw, Washington, which is about 40 miles southwest of Seattle. It turned out that they had moved there a week before Bonnie disappeared. However, several people saw Gary in the neighborhood on the night Bonnie went missing. Gary was brought to the police station, and he told the detectives he knew nothing about Bonnie's disappearance. Gary was released but was asked to return in a few days for a polygraph exam. Instead, Gary and Nancy fled the area, and the police lost track of them. The couple went to Portland, Oregon for a brief time. In January 1975, Gary and Nancy split up. Nancy moved to San Diego, California. In January 1975, the Michigan authorities issued a nationwide alert that Gary was to be picked up and brought back to Michigan because he was not seeking psychiatric help. This alert should have gone out 18 months earlier, but there had been a clerical error. After splitting up with Helen, Gary moved to Houston, Texas. In March and April 1975, Gary raped 5 women at gunpoint in Houston. Often he attacked women who managed apartment complexes. Usually he pulled out a gun when she was showing him an apartment and then raped her. In late April 1975, he forced a pregnant 16-year-old girl to come to his hotel room where he raped her. Afterward, he fell asleep and the young woman escaped. She called the police. By the time the police arrived, Gary was gone. When he registered for the room, he gave the name Sarge Taylor. He also gave his real license plate number. The police looked up the license plate and realized that Gary was wanted in Michigan. The police in Houston started to search for Gary. About a month later, thanks to an anonymous tip, they discovered where he was working and living. On May 20th, 1975, 39-year-old Gary Taylor was arrested for the 5 sexual assaults. His estranged wife, Helen, learned he had been arrested, and through her lawyer, she contacted the Houston police. She told them that her husband would get drunk and tell her about the people he killed. Helen said she was sure there were 4 bodies buried in the yard of their former home in Onstead, and Bonnie Stuff's body was buried in the backyard of their home in Enumclaw. 2 days after Gary was arrested, the police searched the property in Onstead. In shallow graves beside the main bedroom window were the dead bodies of 2 women. Their IDs were with their remains. They were 24-year-old Lee Fletcher and 17-year-old Debbie Henneman. They went missing months earlier, in late March 1975, from a bar in Toledo, Ohio. They were last seen getting into a vehicle with Michigan plates. Onstead is about 25 miles northwest of Toledo. Both women had been shot in the head. No other bodies were found on the property, and after a few days, the search was called off. On May 21st, 1975, the police started searching the property in Enumclaw. 4 days after Gary was arrested, the police uncovered the remains of 19-year-old Fonnie Stuth. Fonnie had been shot once in the head. After the bodies were found, Gary Taylor confessed to the 3 murders. He also confessed to a 4th, where he was not a suspect. Days before he was arrested, while the police were on the hunt for him for the 5 sexual assaults, 21-year-old Susan Jackson, who worked as a go-go dancer, went missing from the bar where she worked in Houston. 4 days later, her body was found in an isolated area outside of Houston. She had been asphyxiated to death. On May 29, 1975, Gary Taylor was charged with the first-degree murder of Bonnie Stuth. He was extradited to Washington. In April 1976, Gary pleaded guilty to second-degree murder for killing Bonnie Stuth. He was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The authorities said that Gary would never get parole, and if he did, he'd be charged with one of the other 3 murders. These 4 murders are not the only ones that Gary Taylor is believed to have committed. In the autumn of 1973, 33-year-old Sandra Horvath was a divorced mother of 3. She lived with her 3 daughters in Ann Arbor, Michigan. On the night of October 1st, 1973, Sandra put her kids to bed. The children woke up the next morning and discovered their mother was missing. Her bed was made and the car was in the driveway. The police were called and they saw that the flower bed in the backyard had been trampled. A neighbor heard a commotion from Sandra's backyard at around 10:50 on the night she went missing. Sandra Horvath was never seen or heard from again. Gary Taylor lived close to Sandra and moved away from the area shortly after she went missing. He was questioned about her disappearance. He admitted that he knew Sandra, but he had nothing to do with her disappearance and didn't know what happened to her. 2 articles published in autumn 2023 state that 87-year-old Gary Addison Taylor was incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. However, we could not find any record of him incarcerated in Washington. There are also no records of him being paroled or extradited to another state. So in the last year, he most likely died in prison. Number 2. Jon Dunkle. In November 1981, the Davies family lived in Belmont, California, a city in the San Francisco Bay Area. James and Joan Davies had 2 sons, 17-year-old Mark and 15-year-old John. On the night of November 8, 1981, James and Joan went out for the evening. They returned home around 1:30 a.m. and found nothing unusual. The next morning, Joan went into the room of her 15-year-old son, John. John was not in his room or the house. His clothes for church that morning were set out, and all his possessions, like his shoes, were at home. James called the police and reported his son missing. John's 17-year-old brother, Mark, talked to the police. He said that John went to bed at around 10:30 p.m. and he went to bed about half an hour later. He did not hear or see anything unusual. Initially, it was thought that Mark had run away. But when no one in his life had heard from him after 11 months, the police asked the FBI for assistance. But they were unable to figure out what happened to the 15-year-old boy. 3 years went by and no progress was made in the case. On the afternoon of October 2, 1984, 12-year-old Lance Turner was supposed to attend soccer practice in Belmont. He got a ride to the soccer pitch with a teammate's father. But when soccer practice began, Lance wasn't there. Lance's mother reported him missing about 3 hours later at 7 p.m. About 80 minutes later, Lance's body was found near Water Dog Lake, which is about 3/8 of a mile from the soccer pitch. Lance had been stabbed 23 times. 3 girls who were in the area at the time talked to the police. They said they encountered a young man at the lake. He was smoking and drinking beer. He told them his name was John and he had graduated from Carlmont High School the year before. The 3 girls described him as having dirty blonde hair and acne. The 3 girls described the man to a sketch artist, and the sketch was released to the public. A few weeks later, an employee at Carlmont High School said he believed that the sketch was of Jon Dunkle. Dunkle had attended Claremont High School. He graduated in 1979. This caught the attention of the police for several reasons. Notably, the 3 girls the man said they saw near the lake said his name was John and he had attended Carlmont High School. Something else that really drew the police to Dunkle was that he was good friends of 15-year-old John Davies, who, after 3 years, was still missing. Dunkle had also been friends with John's older brother, Mark. Mark told the police that Dunkle used to come to their home and throw rocks at his window to get his attention without stirring his parents. He assumed that Dunkle did the same thing with John. Often they would go to a nearby partially abandoned hospital to explore and drink beer. John's mother, Joan, said that John and Dunkle would sit in Dunkle's car and listen to music. The Davies family thought that Dunkle's behavior was odd after John disappeared. Several days after John went missing, he came by their home and picked up some missing persons flyers. They never saw or heard from him again. It turned out that shortly after the murder of Lance Turner, Dunkle moved over 100 miles away from Belmont to Sacramento, California. On December 4th and 7th, 1985, the police interviewed 24-year-old Jon Dunkle about the disappearance of 15-year-old John Davies and the murder of 12-year-old Lance Turner. Dunkle said on the night John went missing, he was at home with his parents. He claimed he never threw rocks at John or Mark's windows, and he never went to the partially abandoned hospital with Mark. As for the murder of Lance Turner, he said at the time he was filling out job applications in Redwood City, about 6 miles from the crime scene. The police thought that Dunkle's answers were odd. Why would he deny so many things about his relationship with John? The police also checked the places where Dunkle claimed he filled out applications. No one said he came in that day. The problem was that the police didn't have any physical evidence that connected Dunkle to either murder, but the police were convinced he was the killer of the 2 boys. The police hatched a plan. Belmont police officer Lisa Thomas would go undercover and work at the same fast food restaurant as Dunkle and befriend him. She wore a wire when she met with him. After meeting, Thomas started visiting Dunkle at home, and sometimes they go to the movies together or go to a bar. Dunkle talked about his fascination with the disappearance of John and the murder of Lance, while he maintained he did not kill them. On April 4th, 1985, Thomas and Dunkle were drinking at a bar. Afterward, they went for a walk and came across a house. Dunkle walked up to a side door and found it was unlocked. He asked Thomas, the undercover police officer, to act as a lookout. Dunkle entered the home and Thomas went to a neighbor's home. She woke them up and called the sheriff's department. The homeowner in the house Dunkle entered heard something and went to investigate. He found Dunkle taking the covers off his young daughter. Dunkle ran from the house and was arrested by a sheriff's deputy who had arrived on the scene. 4 days later, Dunkle was released on bail. Months later, on July 2, 1985, 12-year-old Jon Dunkle left his friend's home in Sacramento at around 7:30 p.m. He was riding his bike home. He never made it home and he was reported missing. Dunkle was interviewed 2 days after Jon vanished. He said he knew nothing about the disappearance. Dunkle said on the night Jon went missing, he was drinking beers with friends at Lower Sunrise Park. He then went home. On July 8th, about 5 days after Jon went missing, his nude body was found in Lower Sunrise Park. Close to his body was a beer can and a 2x4 with a nail in it. Jon had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck and once in each eye. The stab wounds were odd. It was made with a pick-like tool, and traces of marijuana resin were found in the wounds. The nail on the board appeared to have been driven into his head. Although he was naked, there were no signs of sexual assault. The police did not think it was a coincidence that Jon's body was found near a beer can in the same park where Jon Dunkle said he was drinking beer that night. But once again, the police could not find any physical evidence that Dunkle murdered the boy. Then, at the end of November 1995, the police charged Dunkle with another crime. On November 5th, 1982, 16-year-old Stephen Murphy was walking home from a party in San Mateo, California. Suddenly, he was run down by a car. He woke up hours later in the hospital. He had to undergo surgery to remove his spleen and kidney. He also suffered a skull fracture, 3 broken ribs, and a broken pelvis. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital. In February 1985, months before Dunkle was arrested for breaking into the house, he and Lisa Thomas were on a picnic. To encourage Dunkle to open up and build trust, Thomas made up a story about something illegal she had done. She told him that once she had been involved in a hit and run. He then confessed to running down Steve Murphy. Dunkle said he had been drinking on the beach and then he was driving around. He saw Steve, a stranger to him, and ran him down. He loaded Steve into the car and then dumped him in a ditch. Steve was found by a passerby and brought to the hospital. Dunkle was excited when he talked about the hit and run. He said that Steve's head was split open and there were hairs on his bumper. Dunkle said that afterward he cleaned his car. It's unclear why the police took 7 months to charge him with the hit and run. At the same picnic, Dunkle told Thomas another disturbing story. About a month after he ran down Steve Murphy, on New Year's Eve 1982, he was drinking alcohol with his friend, 16-year-old Monty Hansen. Dunkle attacked Monty with a 2x4 with nails embedded in it. He hit him once in the head, but Monty was able to stop the rest of the blows. Dunkle then left. Monty had never reported the assault to the police. Although Dunkle had confessed to the assault, he was never charged. In May 1986, Dunkle pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor hit and run and did not get any jail time. He also pleaded no contest to burglary. He was sentenced to the maximum 6 years of prison. Months later, in mid-September 1985, Dunkle's cellmate, Charles Rice, contacted prison authorities. He told them that Dunkle had confessed to the murders of John Davies and Lance Turner. Rice said he was sure he could get more information from Dunkle. Rice said he did not want anything in return in exchange for the information. He hated child killers, and he was appalled by Dunkle's crimes. 6 days later, Rice handed over 2 maps Dunkle drew of the crime scenes. A week later, Rice went into the cell wearing a wire. Dunkle described the murders of John and Lance. Dunkle said he would never cooperate with the Belmont police because he didn't trust them. Rice lied and told him he had a friend who was an FBI agent and suggested confessing to him. Dunkle agreed. The FBI got an agent to pose as Rice's friend, and on October 3, 1986, Jon Dunkle confessed. He said earlier on the night he murdered 16-year-old John Davies, he was drinking and smoking marijuana with friends. He went to the Davies home and entered through an unlocked side door. He went to John's room and asked him if he wanted to go drink beer. John agreed, and he left home without shoes. They drove to a large nature preserve in Redwood City. Dunkle parked the car and John got out first. Dunkle took a hunting knife from the glove compartment before leaving the car. He first stabbed John in the back and John fell to the ground. He then sat on his chest and stabbed him in the neck. He then picked up a rock and hit him 3 times in the head. There was an opening in the ground close by, and he pushed the body into it. Dunkle said he returned to see the body a week later. Then he visited the remains again 2 years later, in May 1984. He drew a map to the remains. The FBI agent asked why he killed his friend. Dunkle said he had had the urge to kill since the 6th grade. He said the only issue he had with John was that he could make the computer monitor flash irritating messages. He also said that when he drank and smoked marijuana, like he was doing that night, he became aggressive. He said when he got to the nature preserve, he had committed himself to killing John. Dunkle said that on October 2, 1984, he was packing to move to Sacramento. He took a break and bought a 6-pack of beer, which he took to the lake to drink. He talked to the 3 girls and shared a beer with them. Shortly after they left, 12-year-old Lance Turner jogged by him. He was jogging to warm up for soccer. Dunkle got him to stop by asking him for the time. He then attacked Lance with a hunting knife he had on him. Again, there was no motive other than he wanted to kill someone. He then buried the knife. Dunkle said on July 2, 1985, he had been drinking with friends. Afterward, as he was riding his bike home through the park, he saw 12-year-old Sean Daniel, who was riding his bike. Dunkle told the FBI agent, quote, "I knew right then I was going to stop and kill him," unquote. He rammed his bike into Sean's bike, and Sean fell off. He then led Sean to a large tree. Dunkle said that Sean made him angry because he went along with it and he had not fought him like his other victims. So he decided to humiliate him. He forced Sean to undress and lie on his back on the ground. He then put the 2x4 over his eyes. Dunkle explained he cleaned his marijuana pipe with an electrician's instrument that had a pick on it. He had the instrument on him. He used it to stab Sean in the chest and neck. The pick came off in his chest. He pulled it out and screwed it back on to the handle. He then stabbed him in both eyes. The day after the confession, the police found the remains of John Davies. He had been missing for 5 years. The pathologist said that John's injuries were consistent with Dunkle's confession. 2 days later, in a field, they found the knife used to kill Lance Turner. Sean and Lance were killed in one county, and Sean was killed in another, so there were to be 2 trials. It took 4 years for Dunkle to go to trial for the murders of John and Lance because his lawyer argued that Dunkle was not competent to stand trial. Dunkle had mental illness and believed a computer was controlling his mind when he committed the murders. 3 doctors all agreed he had severe mental illness. They said he was psychotic and had schizophrenia. But he was finally found competent to go to trial, and it began on November 29, 1989. Dunkle's lawyer acknowledged that Dunkle committed the 2 murders, but he said he should only be found guilty of second-degree murder and not first-degree murder. If he were found guilty of second-degree murder, he would not be eligible for the death penalty. The trial lasted a week, and the jury deliberated for 2 hours. 29-year-old Jon Dunkle was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. During the sentencing phase, Dunkle's lawyer argued that he should be spared the death penalty because he had mental illness and his IQ was so low that he had borderline intellectual functioning. But the jury recommended the death penalty. On January 10, 1990, the judge followed the jury's recommendation and sentenced 29-year-old Jon Dunkle to death. In January 1995, Dunkle pleaded guilty to the murder of 12-year-old Sean Daniel. He was sentenced to life without the chance of parole. While on death row, Dunkle's mental health deteriorated. He was convinced a computer was in his head and a radio was in his shoulder. He refused to have a TV or radio in his cell. He would bang his head on the wall of the cell. He said he did that when he fought with a computer in his head. In the summer of 2002, Dunkle had such severe mental illness that he was assigned a guardian. He was the only death row inmate in California to have a guardian. This raised questions about whether he was eligible for the death penalty because it goes against the Supreme Court's ruling that it is unconstitutional to execute someone who is insane. However, Dunkle has remained on death row. At the time of this recording, 64-year-old Jon Dunkle is serving a sentence at San Quentin State Prison in San Quentin, California. California has not executed anyone since 2006, and at the time of this recording, there are plans to abolish the death penalty in the state. Number 1. Larry Eyler. On October 23, 1982, the dead body of 19-year-old Stephen Crockett was found in a cornfield outside of Kankakee, Illinois. He had been stabbed 32 times, including 4 times in the face. He lived in the Chicago, Illinois neighborhood of Uptown, about 60 miles south of where his body was found. He was murdered a short time before his body was discovered. Months later, on Christmas Day 1982, the remains of 25-year-old John Johnson were found a short distance away in Lowell, Indiana. Johnson had been stabbed 15 times. Johnson went missing from Uptown around the same time Crockett's body was found. 3 days later, on December 28, 1982, 2 more dead bodies were found. The body of 23-year-old Stephen Egan was found in a wooded area next to the highway near Newport, Indiana. His throat had been slashed, and his chest and abdomen had been cut open. Egan lived in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he worked at his father's car wash. He was last seen alive on December 19th, 9 days before his body was found. The second body found that day was found beside a highway in Putnam County, Illinois. He was identified as 21-year-old John Roach, who lived in Indianapolis, Indiana. He had been stabbed to death 6 days earlier. 2 months later, on March 5, 1983, the remains of 26-year-old Edgar Underculfer were found in a field near Danville, Illinois. Underculfer was last seen alive months earlier on October 30, 1982. He was an airman who was stationed at the Chanute Air Force Base in Rantoul, Illinois. He was last seen alive when he left the base to go into town for a weekend leave. On April 8, 1983, 28-year-old Gustavo Herrera's dead body was found under some debris in Lake Forest, Illinois, not far from Interstate 94. He had been stabbed multiple times in the abdomen. His intestines were hanging out of his body. His right hand had been cut off and it was found near his body. Herrera lived in uptown Chicago. He was the father of 2. He occasionally went to gay bars. It's believed that Herrera was murdered on the same day his body was found. A week later, on April 15, 1983, the body of a teenage boy was found in a wooded area in Forest Lake, Illinois. His body was also found close to Interstate 94. He was stabbed multiple times in the back and once in the neck. Months later, in October 1983, he was identified as 16-year-old Irvin Gibson, who lived in Uptown. Gibson was a troubled young man. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade, and he had been in a juvenile institution for truancy. He was known to leave home for several days and not contact his family. His family last saw him on January 25, 1983, about 2.5 months before his body was found. On May 9, 1983, the body of 18-year-old Jimmy Roberts, who lived in Chicago, was found in a creek in Cook County, Illinois. He had been stabbed 30 times. He was last seen alive 5 days earlier. That same day, 300 miles away in Henderson County, Indiana, another body was found. He was identified as 21-year-old Daniel Scott McNevey. He lived in Indianapolis and had done sex work. He had been stabbed 11 times in the neck, 5 times in the back, and 11 times in the abdomen. It's believed that McNevey was killed 2 days before his body was found. In 6 months, the bodies of 9 young men have been found, and the police believed a serial killer was on the loose. Besides all being young men, there were several other similarities. They had all been stabbed to death, and their bodies were dumped near major highways. Many of the men were involved in the sex trade. A lot of the victims had their pants pulled down to their ankles. A task force to investigate the murders was started. The serial killer was nicknamed the Highway Killer. In June 1983, the police had a prime suspect, 30-year-old Larry Eyler. Eyler was born in December 1952 in Crawfordsville, Indiana. His parents divorced when he was a teenager, and his stepfather was abusive. In August 1978, Eyler moved to Terre Haute, Indiana, and he still resided there. He worked for the Equal Economic Opportunities Commission, which provided financial aid to needy people. He was considered warm and well-liked. Eyler was openly gay and was well known in the gay scene, especially the leather fetish scene. On June 6, 1983, someone called the task force and suggested Eyler as a suspect. The caller, believed to have been one of Eyler's former lovers, had a dark story about him. In August 1983, Eyler picked up a teenage hitchhiker in Terre Haute. The hitchhiker rejected Eyler's sexual advances, so Eyler pulled out a butcher knife. He then drove down a dark road. He had the hitchhiker get into the bed of his pickup truck. He had the hitchhiker take off his clothes. He then put handcuffs on him and caressed his body with the knife. The hitchhiker managed to fight Eyler off and ran. Eyler chased him and stabbed him once in the chest. The hitchhiker played dead. Eyler took off in his truck. After he was gone, the hitchhiker reached a nearby home and the resident phoned for help. The hitchhiker was taken to the hospital and survived. After stabbing the hitchhiker, Eyler also went to a nearby home. He confessed to the residents and they called the police. Eyler was arrested. But then weeks later, the charges against Eyler were dropped because the hitchhiker chose not to press charges. It turned out that Eyler's lawyer paid him $2,500 not to pursue the matter. For stabbing the young man, Eyler had to pay $43 in court costs. The charges were dismissed with prejudice. In the highway murders, the police investigated other persons of interest. The only person they could not eliminate as a suspect was Larry Eyler. He was put under rolling surveillance. Sadly, bodies of young men kept turning up. On July 2, 1983, the body of a man was found in Ford County, Illinois. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. The young man had been dead for about 4 to 5 days. The man has never been identified. Shortly after that murder, Eyler moved to Indianapolis and worked as a house painter. On August 31, 1983, 28-year-old Ralph Collis was found stabbed to death in Lake Forest, Illinois. His body was found just a few miles from where Gustavo Herrera and Irvin Gibson's bodies were found in April 1983. He had been stabbed 17 times earlier that day. On September 30, 1983, a police officer cruising on an interstate outside of Indianapolis noticed a pickup truck parked on the shoulder. There were 2 figures walking away from the truck. One of them appeared to be bound. The officer approached the men. He saw that one man's wrists were handcuffed. The men said they were doing something consensual. The officer got the 2 men's IDs and did background checks. He learned that Eyler was a suspect in the serial murders. The police brought Eyler in for questioning and held him in custody for 12 hours. The police searched his truck and found a hunting knife with human blood on it. It was the same blood type as the last victim, Ralph Collis. Also in the truck they found surgical tape and nylon clothes wire. The police compared Eyler's tire and boot treads to tire and boot tracks found close to Collis's body. Both the treads and the prints were similar. On October 1, 1983, Larry Eyler was arrested for Collis's murder. He was held in jail with a $1 million bond. 2 weeks later, the skeletal remains of a man were found in a farmer's field in Rensselaer, Illinois. There was evidence he had been stabbed to death. He remained unidentified for 38 years. In 2021, he was identified as 19-year-old William Lewis, who lived in Peru, Indiana. He was last seen alive over a year earlier, in November 1982. 4 days and 15 miles away from where Lewis's body was found, a gruesome discovery was made. At an abandoned farm in Newton County, Indiana, were 4 dead bodies. All had been stabbed multiple times. One of the bodies had been dismembered and his head was missing. At the time, they could only identify 2 of the bodies 22-year-old Michael Bauer, and 19-year-old John Bartlett. In 2019, another one of the bodies was identified. It was the dismembered, headless body. He was 19-year-old John Ingram Bradenberg from Chicago. Then in 2023, the fourth body was identified, 16-year-old Keith Lavelle Bibbs, who also lived in Chicago. All four men had been dead for several months. Although their bodies were found in the same area, it's not believed it was a mass murder. Their bodies were dumped there at different times. The police said that their murders were like the other 11 that they knew about. On December 5, 1983, the body of another man was found in Effingham, Illinois. He was identified as 25-year-old Richard Bruce. He had been dead for about a half a year. Bruce had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. 2 days later, 2 more bodies were found outside of Indianapolis. One was identified as 17-year-old Richard Wayne, who went missing from Indianapolis over 6 months earlier in March 1983. The other set of remains were badly decomposed. He was a black man between the ages of 25 and 39. He has never been identified. Due to the level of decomposition, it's believed that his remains were there longer than Wayne's body. On October 26, 1983, the task force tracked down a witness they thought might be helpful. 11 months earlier, on November 21, 1982, 21-year-old Craig Townsend, who lived in Uptown, was found drugged and beaten close to Lowell, Indiana. He was taken to the hospital. But before the police could interview him, he left the hospital. When the task force found him, nearly a year later, he identified Eyler's photo as the man who attacked him. Since his arrest, Eyler had been in jail awaiting trial. A hearing was held in January 1984 because Eyler's lawyer was trying to suppress the evidence in the case. His lawyer argued that the police didn't have a warrant to search Eyler's truck. It was searched after he was found on the side of the highway with a man in handcuffs. The man in the handcuffs said it was consensual, so Eyler wasn't doing anything illegal, so the police had no reason to search his truck. In the truck was the bloody knife, and this led to other search warrants. The judge ruled that the police did not have sufficient evidence to search the truck. So Eyler's boots, handcuffs, and the knife could not be used as evidence. The only evidence the district attorney had was the tire tracks. But this was not strong evidence because the tires were common. Eyler's lawyer then argued that there was insufficient evidence to hold him on $1 million bond. The district attorney argued that Eyler was the suspect in 18 other murders. Eyler's lawyer pointed out he had never been charged in those murders and there was no evidence he committed them. The judge agreed and lowered his bond to $10,000. Eyler posted bond on February 6, 1983 and walked out of jail. He then settled in Chicago. On May 7, 1984, the skeletal remains of 22-year-old David Block were found near Lake Forest. He had been missing since December 1982. Then on August 21, 1984, an apartment building custodian in Chicago found that the building's dumpster was overflowing. There were a lot of gray garbage bags. He started to remove the bags from the dumpster. One of the bags ripped open and he saw a human leg. He called the police. The police talked to a building resident who said that the day before, a man who lived next door to the apartment building had put the garbage bags in the dumpster. He asked the man why he was doing it. The man said he was getting rid of some stuff. The police learned that man was Larry Eyler. The police got a search warrant for Eyler's home. They found bloodstains, a bloody hacksaw, and matching garbage bags. The body was later identified as 16-year-old Danny Bridges, who had been a sex worker. It was later determined that one of Bridges' shirts was found in Eyler's home. Eyler was charged with Bridges' murder. Larry Eyler went to trial for Bridges' murder 2 years later, in July 1986. The trial lasted 8 days, and the jury deliberated for 3 hours. Eyler was found guilty of murdering Danny Bridges. In October 1986, Eyler was sentenced to death. 4 years later, in November 1990, the police reopened the murder of Stephen Egan. The body of the 23-year-old man was found 3 days after Christmas in 1982 near Newport, Indiana. Some speculate that the case was reopened because a book, Freed to Kill, by Geraldine Caloric and Wayne Klatt had recently been published. But the prosecution denied that this was the case. Eyler confessed to the murder. He had an unusual story about the murder. He claims he did not commit it alone. Eyler said that his former lover suggested killing someone together. His lover was Dr. Robert Little, a chairman of library sciences at Indiana State University. They kidnapped Egan together and took him to an abandoned farm building. Eyler said they hung him from a beam. Eyler claimed that Little directed him and took photographs. Eyler said that Little ordered him to stab Egan, so he did, and this killed the 23-year-old man. Little then took the knife and stabbed him again. Little thought that the death went too quickly, so they lowered Egan's body. Then Eyler beat the body with a board while Little photographed it. Eyler took a polygraph exam and he supposedly passed. On December 14, 1990, Eyler pleaded guilty to the murder of Egan. 2 weeks later, he was sentenced to 60 years of prison. On December 18, 1990, Robert Little turned himself in to the police. He denied having anything to do with the murder. Robert Little went to trial in April 1991. There was no physical evidence that connected him to the crime. Eyler's testimony was the only evidence against him. Little's defense lawyer argued that Eyler was a liar. There was also 4 witnesses who said that Little may have been in Florida at the time of the murder. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Robert Little was found not guilty. On March 6, 1994, while sitting on death row, 41-year-old Larry Eyler died of AIDS-related complications. Eyler most likely contracted the disease in 1984, and he was diagnosed in 1990. 2 days after Eyler died, his lawyer, Kathleen Zellner, released his confession that she had recorded over the previous 2 years. Before he died, Eyler agreed to have the confession made public after his death. Eyler confessed to 20 of the murders we covered in this video. One murder he maintained he did not commit was one of the 2 he was convicted of, the murder of 16-year-old Danny Bridges. He claims that Robert Little committed the murder. Eyler also said that Little helped him commit his first homicide, the murder of 19-year-old Stephen Crockett. He also maintained that Little took part in the murder of Stephen Egan, which Little went to trial for and was acquitted of. Eyler also claimed that Little helped murder John Ingram Bradenberg, whose headless body was found in October 1983. Eyler said that Little ordered him to decapitate the body and get rid of the head because he wanted to obscure the identity of the young man because Bradenberg could be connected to him. Eyler said that he and Little committed one more murder together in Chicago in June 1984. The remains have never been found. Eyler described the victim as white, between the ages of 16 and 19, and he was from Chicago. If Eyler did kill this victim, that means he killed 2 teenage boys after he was released on bond. Robert Little was not charged with any other crimes. The police and the media do not believe these are the only murders Larry Eyler committed. In October 1982, 14-year-old Delvoyd Baker was in the 8th grade and lived in Indianapolis, Indiana. At about 4:30 p.m. on October 2, 1982, about 3 weeks before Eyler committed the first murder he confessed to, Baker left his home on his bike. When he didn't return home, his family reported him missing. 2 days later, his dead body was found in a ditch. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. The police don't know what was used to strangle him, but it was smaller than a rope. He was fully clothed and there were no signs of sexual assault. There is an alternative suspect in this case. A man had contacted the police and said he had paid Baker $20 for oral sex. After he dropped Baker off, he saw Baker enter a van. He gave the police some numbers on the license plate. The police tracked down the van and discovered it belonged to a prominent local businessman, August Cato. However, the police never found any physical evidence that connected Cato with the murder. He was summoned to testify under oath in front of the grand jury. He refused and he was held in contempt of court. No one has ever been charged in Delvoye Baker's murder. It remains unsolved. Larry Eyler is the prime suspect in the March 22, 1983 murder of 29-year-old Jay Reynolds. Reynolds was stabbed to death outside Lexington, Kentucky, which is about 260 miles from where Eyler was living at the time. The police said that Reynolds' murder matches the pattern of the other murders. Finally, there's the murder of 18-year-old Eric Hansen. Hansen was a troubled teenager who was last seen alive on September 27, 1983 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He told his mother he was going to Indiana. A little more than a week later, a pair of mushroom hunters found his torso in a garbage bag in a park in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Other body parts were found close by. His head and hands were never found. He had been drained of blood and dismembered with a hacksaw. The remains were found about 250 miles north of Eyler's home. The problem with these murders is why would Eyler confess to the other 21 murders but not these 3? Sadly, 3 of Eyler's victims remain unidentified. One is the John Doe, which was found in July 1983 in Ford County, Illinois. He's described as Hispanic, between the ages of 20 and 30, 5'8" to 5'9", and weighed between 105 and 115 pounds. The second is the John Doe found in December 1983 in Hendricks County, Indiana. He was black, ages 25 to 39, he was 5'9", and weighed around 130 pounds. Finally, there's the victim, who was never found. He went missing from Chicago in June 1984. He was described as a white teenage boy between the ages of 16 and 19. Thank you so much for watching today's video. We just want to remind you we started a channel membership where half the funds will go to solve a cold case. For more information, click on the video that's on the screen now. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.